All right. Welcome to the Wednesday, April 14th, 2021 School Board Budget Workshop. Would all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Welcome back. We were just here less than 2 days ago. But this is for our budget for next school year. First thing we need to do is approve the agenda. I will take a motion when someone's ready.
For the school budget workshop.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Bridges, I heard first.
Yep.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Mr. Bryant, take it away, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Craven and members of the board. And I apologize first and foremost for asking everybody to be inside on such a lovely day. I was speaking with Mr. Bridges and Mrs. Case as we got started, and if we had ample space to be outside, this would be the day to do it. It is a gorgeous day. So thanks for spending your early afternoon on a Chamber of Commerce day inside. And as we get started, I'd love to just kind of give a bit of an overview about what is the opportunity here for us as a board workshop and the position that it puts us in, because in many ways a budget conversation is an especially exciting one. It's a time of optimism. Over the last several months, we have been looking down, we've been grinding, and a budget conversation is a chance to really look up. It's a chance for us to sort of see the horizon, to talk about the upcoming school year, to talk about the ways that we are going to serve and support our students and our school communities in that space, and to do it very, very well. And so the best way to think of today, I think for us, is this is an opportunity for the board to have an overview of that direction and that pathway forward, for us to be engaged in conversation, for you to ask questions, to request information, to share with us the information that you need to help set that direction as it relates to our school system. And it's important that the leadership team and staff hear those questions and that dialogue from you, so that we can help give you the information that you need to ultimately approve a budget that we will take to the Board of Commissioners in May. And again, this is the beginning of the conversation. We will meet again later this month after this dialogue today, and the notes that we take from this dialogue and the priorities that the board sets forth. But again, it is really a chance for us to think about maybe three categories, and I might invite that in this opening slide, because the strength of the Board of Education has been its commitment to stewardship, and its commitment to investment, its commitment to improvement, and its commitment to opportunities that present themselves. And as we often talk about, we want to think through those four lenses as we move forward, and then thinking about that stewardship, that investment, that improvement, and that opportunity, and how we take care of our people, how we serve our students, how we continue to provide resources for our schools and our communities moving forward. And that will really be the lens for the presentations today. And so, Mr. Chairman, if it's acceptable, I would invite the board to stop me at any time if you have questions about anything that you see on the slide. Certainly the leadership team and I will be available to answer questions where we can. And if we can't, we will certainly find the answers to those questions. We will bring those back to you when we come together later on this month and be able to discuss each of those in more detail for you. So we'll begin by kind of understanding where we are right now. And this picture is the look at our total budget allocation for the current fiscal year. And that's really broken up into a couple of categories that you're very familiar with, but I think are helpful as a starting point. And that first is to understand our current expense, or our operating budget, that comes from local government. And that's $28,928,000. That's separate from a capital outlay allowance that we receive for annual maintenance and safety enhancements. And in that most recent year, that's $1.5 million. And to the credit of the Board of Education and the support of the Board of Commissioners, at the time that this budget was approved, we also took into account that there were a lot of unknowns moving forward, as there continue to be unknowns. But there was a COVID reserve in that capital outlay of $400,000, and we discussed some of that on Monday afternoon as it relates to how those dollars have allowed the board to navigate needs for the school system moving forward. And then capital outlay, what we affectionately refer to as Mr. T money, that maintenance, repair, technology, and safety. But Mr. T money is, if you flip over your tax bill, you see that there's 3 cents on the effective tax rate in our community that is dedicated toward capital projects. And we're going to talk more about that as we go through the slides. But as this board will remember, those funds were on hold during the COVID period as we were waiting to see what that impact might be in Henderson County. And those funds were released for 3 very specific projects in February of 2021. The Upward Elementary renovation for double point entry, the Rugby Middle School project for, again, the redo of the entryway for double point entry, and then our Project Empower investment, the Chromebook sustainability piece there. And so our total appropriation for this current year is $30.8 million. When we think about that, we also have to take that slice, which is the red slice, that local money, and also think about what other sources of funding help the school system to operate. And I think that this picture is a particularly helpful one because when we talk about our operations, we're not just talking about local operations. Our revenue sources involve federal monies, just shy of $9 million, other local restricted dollars, which are just short of $2 million, and then, of course, the predominant funding source for the school system is the state of North Carolina, again, just shy of $87 million that the school system used to operate. And you might be asking, I'm going to tee Mr. Socia up right here, you might have seen these first 2 slides and said, why doesn't the red slice of this particular pie match the previous slide when you think about current expense? Because that's our operating, because you would notice that those 2 numbers are different. But Mr. Socia, always at the ready, I'm going to say, Mr. Socia, why is it that those 2 slides don't match? What's different about the red slice?
The red slice here includes the fines and forfeitures and agency revenues that pass through to us throughout the course of the year in appropriation. Dr. Bryant was showing you on the first slide.
Right. So it's important to understand those fines and forfeiture dollars that come to us, that are passed through to us. Those would be added to our operating budget. This doesn't include the capital dollars in terms of operating, but that's why you would see that those 2 would be different.
Can I ask?
Yes, ma'am.
I know I've asked before, but I can't remember. What is that money, the fines and forfeiture money? What is that specific to? What can we spend that on?
That's local, that's up to our discretion.
Okay, so anywhere we feel fully.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And how much did we receive in last fiscal year or this current fiscal year?
We're looking at getting about 300, well, no, we're looking probably getting less than $300,000.
300,000.
Yeah, we thought it has picked up. Actually less than.
That's right. So as you imagine, one of the conversation points that we sometimes have is when you think about fines and forfeitures, you think about the operation of the judicial system. And so when it was on pause as well during the COVID period, those fines and forfeitures were essentially paused during that period of time. And so it is less than we've received in previous years.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, ma'am, of course.
Our ABC money, is that up this year?
You would
It sure
think.
should be.
You would
Yeah.
think, yeah.
I mean, because you think, everything's been closed down. People have had to go to stores, so.
Yes, ma'am. So we've seen an inverse relationship between those 2 things as it relates
This
to.
might have been moms who were home with their kids.
That's very. We love our moms, so I won't blame anybody, but we certainly know that to be true. When you look at this particular slide, I think it's critical to understand that one of the processes that the school system goes through on an annual basis is to present to the Board of Commissioners in January as their budget cycle begins what that outlook might be. And this is a 2-year snapshot as it relates to our current year and our future fiscal year. And why this has been critically important, and again, we applaud that relationship that we have with the Board of Commissioners, is as they go through their valuation cycle and they make determinations about what their budget is going to be, they tend to think about that in a 4-year increment period. And so under Mr. Caldwell's leadership and previously, when we began to have these conversations with the Board of Commissioners, we really helped to give them a 4-year picture of what our needs might be moving forward so that they would have some sense of the direction that we were moving. And so in January of this year, I presented to the Board of Commissioners our current operational budget, and that's that fiscal year 2021. And then again, an estimated or approximate fiscal 22 in the direction that we might move forward. And when you think about line 2 there, that increase to current expense and uncontrollables, it's helpful to again fully understand what that category means, and we're going to talk about that in several different ways. When we think about the local impact to our budget, the state makes decisions about the retirement rate, hospitalization, salary schedule increases, the pass-through dollars that go to charter schools, and we'll talk about each of those pieces. We have to anticipate what those things will be. And why that's a little bit challenging for us and why we're so very fortunate to have Mr. Socia and his team is because the state does not approve a budget at the same time that we do. So while the governor will push out a budget proposal and then the General Assembly pushes out budget proposals, we have to anticipate what those possible increases are and be very thoughtful in that, be very conservative in those anticipations, and be ready in the budget that we present in May to the Board of Commissioners, knowing that the state may not approve a budget sometimes until well after that. And so when we think about that uncontrollable line, one of our projections when we had that 4-year outlook with the Board of Commissioners was that's approximately 3.5% of our continuation. So if you were to kind of calculate that out, you would see that that approximation of a $1 million increase each year to our bottom line is taking into account about 3.5% of an increase. In fiscal 22, again, we would have a continuation of the capital outlay at $1.5 million. Capital outlay related to COVID or COVID uncontrollables is a zero in this line, as we think about how we move forward and what we've learned and what we know differently at this time. And then again, our capital outlay for that Mr. T money or that MRTS money, maintenance, repair, technology, and security, is $4.67 million. Again, it's 3 cents on the tax rate. As we hear the Board of Commissioners estimate for every cent that you have, it's about $1.5 million that comes to us. And again, because of our conversations around asset preservation and improvements and renovations and those capital needs, they've dedicated those dollars, 2 cents to the community college and 3 cents to Henderson County Public Schools. Another helpful thing for us to see is to understand the fund balance trend for our school system and our school system operations. You can kind of see how that is trending over the last 10 years or so. I'll make specific note of fiscal year 11. Some members of the board are very familiar with that fiscal cliff period that we experienced. The ARA funds that came from the federal government, they are going to be similar to the last part of our conversation today when we talk about ESSER and the way that those dollars came in. Those dollars were essentially held in reserve because we knew that there were going to be cuts moving forward. It was about sustainability. It was about long-range planning. And then you see how the board intentionally spent down that fund balance to operate the school system moving forward. And then we've intentionally started to build that back. And what we have tried to do is maintain a fund balance that is cash reserve that mirrors our largest payroll month. So when you think about why we hold money in reserve, it's not because we're trying to create a savings account or otherwise, but we have to be prepared. The board has to be prepared for strategic needs and otherwise, but we also have to be able to make sure that the largest checks we cash, and those are our payroll checks, and most notably, Mr. Socia would tell you in November when we pay our supplement, and in June when we pay our supplement, that we have cash in the bank that can cover that. And that's been one of our target areas associated with it. And yes, sir.
Is 1 month enough?
Well, 1 month was our target area when we were initially receiving funding from the county. They divide the funding up that they gave to us over a 12-month period. And through dialogue with their finance officer and our finance officer, they realized that that was it would benefit the school system operationally to actually divide that up over 10 months and not 12. And that's given us far greater flexibility for that. But I would certainly defer to Mr. Socia in terms of making sure that you get a fully encompassed answer to that.
That was a huge change for us when they started giving it to us over the first 10 months, because what was happening before was we were getting a portion of our appropriations the last week in June. Did not help us very much. We were done long before that. And it was those fall months where we were particularly in trouble.
What percentage of our employees are 12-month employees as compared to 10-month employees? Is it a large percentage? I wouldn't think so, right? Okay.
What was your question?
What percentage of our employees are 12-month employees as compared to 10-month?
We'll pull that as a data point for the follow-up because I would love for you to be able to make sure that we have that answer. It's far fewer, of course, than the 10-month for our normal. But in terms of dividing that out, we'll make sure that we've got 10 and 12-month for you.
Can you hold on 1 second for me? I'd like for the public, whoever's listening, to be able to hear Mr. Socia, and I think we're going to be relying on him a lot today. Is there a way that we can have you sit like over here in the corner and we can bring a mic over or something to him? Is that possible?
I'll tell you what, we could maybe rotate. Yeah, we could bring in. Dr. Fry is very friendly, and she is.
That's perfect.
She's actually the friendliest member of the leadership team.
Per-
So
yeah, I
if
wouldn't
we're
sit
gonna
by- I wouldn't
slide
share
Mr.
with Scott.
Socia
She's
over
by
to-
far the cutest.
That's
too.
right. That's right.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear him.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Let me
Most
get that
certainly.
recorded. Come on down, Mr. Socia. I've got a couple questions for you as far as fund balance goes.
I'll pause on this slide then, Mr. Craven.
Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
So, when you're thinking about fund balance, I think it's always important to make sure that we maintain a healthy fund balance so that we can take care of the unforeseen things that come up in finance. What do you consider? Are you looking at a percentage of our local? Are you looking at just that November month of what that payroll is? And what is that number that we need to be attaining? Because I fully believe that we shouldn't be hoarding cash. We should be putting money back into the system if we have more than enough. And if we don't have enough, then we need to build that fund balance to an appropriate level. So with that,
Sure. We've looked at that from kind of all those directions over the course of the past few years. We've gone with dollars, we want percentages. The dollars has been an easier target to look at for us. As we're moving forward with all of the ESSER funds that we're going to talk about later, that's kind of changing our opinion of fund balance, because we do want to be able to have a good fund balance to come out of the COVID era with. So I would say we would want to bring that fund balance up even higher than normal in this time period. But typically, better. Okay. The month of November, the local supplemental loan is $3 million out of local. Like we were just talking about with the change in the way we get our money, we don't rely on fund balance for that anymore like we had to. We used to have to rely on our fund balance. We took every penny of fund balance in those lower years just to be able to make payroll those months. So I keep that in the back of my mind, but this new arrangement has helped me sleep better in November.
sure.
A lot better.
Yeah, and I think once we get to ESSER funds, it's going to be an abnormal year, as was 11, and that's not something that we should count on clearly going forward. And so, in your estimation of a normal year, what is a quote unquote a good fund balance?
Kind of where it is. I mean, our local payroll isn't what we're shooting for, because local payroll isn't that much in a typical month. It's if something were to happen that our federal budgets are the other piece we have to look at, because they don't give us our federal dollars early enough, and we have to rely on local to cover federal. So again, in that fall, October timeframe, if we don't have our federal money, we start to rely on local and state to help cover us. So, and there's a lot of answers to your question. It kind of depends on the time of year as to what I feel like. But to have that, that $2.5 million coverage, to be able to hit any local need that we would have, but to be able to cover the supplement and our federal budgets, that is a comfortable number.
$2.5 million is where your minimum is your comfort level.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Other questions about this slide? I referenced charter schools as one of the uncontrollables. And again, why this data is just helpful is to understand how the charter school dollars pass through the school system. And as we've talked about before, one of the values in our state is that people have the opportunity to choose for their children to attend school where they'd like. And that works great. What we have to pay attention to is our budgeting process has to take into account the trends of that, though, because as we receive dollars from the state, for expected enrollment. When students enroll in other environments that are not the public school system, then those dollars follow those students. So when you think about our local ADM for a student just shy of $2,000 per student, then what's happening is when we receive money from Henderson County, the Board of Commissioners, and then a student enrolls, and I'll just use Art Space as an example, then those monies follow that student because they are a Henderson County resident. And they follow that student, as you can see, even if that student attends a school that's not in Henderson County. So if they attend a school elsewhere, those dollars still have to be tracked. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, when we estimate the cost, again, it is very helpful for this board to understand that when we talk about a continuation budget that has, say, $28 million in it, 1.8 of it is leaving us upon receipt. So as we receive information about where Henderson County students are enrolled in a charter school, then those local dollars go with them. And so again, that $1.8 million is significant. And so as you see kind of the trend data associated with it, we have to, again, estimate that number. We don't receive that information until students are officially enrolled, and Mr. Socia and the finance team receive information from each school that says, here's how many kids live in Henderson County, are attending school with us, and so we're essentially invoicing the school for X amount of dollars, and that's what you see us paying attention to. So we see the historical enrollment, we see the estimated enrollment. And estimated enrollment changes, and I'll just use Fernleaf as an example. Each time they add a grade level, or if they add additional grade levels, then they might have additional cohorts of students. And so we have to pay attention to what's happening in our community, because when we make the ask, we're also making an ask for the trend of those students. And so again, that's just important to understand. It's approximately $1.8 million. Yes, sir.
I'll say something real quick about this.
Yes, sir.
You know, I look at this and I'm like, well, you know, if the dollars are following the students, and if the students are leaving the system, and if then our costs may be going down with the student leaving, well, I just want to let the public know that, you know, not necessarily just because one person leaves, or two or three or four or five or whatever, dollars will leave, but not necessarily our costs will go down. So it makes a difference when people leave. Necessarily does not mean our costs will go down, and it just becomes a struggle, not a struggle, but, you know, a challenge to keep doing what we're doing. But that's also why we're always trying to increase our people and to increase our dollars that we're getting, because to cover our costs. But
Yes, sir. And I think that's a wonderful example. You know, again, we talk about this only as a data point specifically, is that we have to make that plan. Right? Again, it's our responsibility to make sure that we have it in our budget to be able to say that these dollars are going to be there. And your example is a great one. If there's one student riding a school bus, or there are 60, the cost to run that bus is the same. And so we have to keep all of those operational costs in mind as we move forward. And so I appreciate that note, Mr.
And
Miller.
isn't it true that when a student winds up coming back to us, as happens, we don't get those dollars back?
That's correct. Once those dollars have been passed through, once we receive that, you know, we think about it, and that is the same, Ms. Caskey, as the way it happens at the state level. You know, when they pull our ADM and then we receive funding for it, that happens kind of one time, and then we have various budget reversions throughout the year. But once that dollar figure is made, if student starts the school year elsewhere and then returns to us in January, those funds do not come back. No, ma'am.
How many virtual charter schools are there?
2 in North Carolina that are considered part of this public. I'm seeing head nods from the people I trust over there to the left. Yes, so the North Carolina Virtual Public Charter School and Associated. So there are 2 that students could enroll with there.
Okay, and all of these charter schools are in North Carolina.
Yes, ma'am.
And if they go out of state somewhere, we don't have to pay for a charter school.
No, ma'am.
Okay.
Other questions about this number?
Are those charter schools that they're held to the same standards we are, right? They have to accept all children, and everybody has to be licensed, and
No, ma'am. No,
oh,
ma'am.
it's not.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to offer that as a follow-up, but the part of what we understand about charter schools is that the rules are different for charter schools. I know we've spoken to that before as it relates to personnel, operations, and otherwise, but specifically, they do not operate by the same guidelines that the public school system does.
I think,
All of them set their own standards.
As part of their charter, they may, yes, sir.
I think a good conversation point on this piece is that, as Mr. Caldwell would used to say, is that we need to provide the best option and the best product
Yep.
in Henderson County, so that these kids are clamoring to come back to our schools. And I think that's our charge, is to make sure that we're producing the best schools that we can, and that's why we're here.
Yes, sir, most certainly. I think, when we talk about kind of honoring school choice, we want to be the choice
Right.
as it relates to that. And certainly those are our efforts moving forward.
Do you think we've lost quite a few of these to charter school because of the COVID?
I wouldn't say that. I think a lot of the decisions during the COVID period, Ms. Case, were directly related to what people's preferences were at that period of time, about what the school operations were at that time. We certainly have seen a strong return in our enrollment base as we've been allowing face-to-face opportunities for people who wanted those. I think we're going to see more about what that trend data looks like moving forward. So we come back to this slide one more time as it relates to the presentation, so that we understand again where those dollars come from. And again, I'll draw your attention to that top right. So when you see that top right and you think about just shy of $29 million and 1.8 of it being a pass-through there, and then our planning associated with what we've presented to the board. When we think about our specific budget request, we're going to focus for the next few minutes on line 2, which is that increase to current expense and the uncontrollables that I spoke about. Those things that we have to plan for, that we have to make sure that we anticipate for, and that we're ready as the state approves a budget and that the local government can approve one for us for our operations to continue into the new school year. Specific to the budget request here, what we're asking the board to consider are a couple of pieces, and I'm going to touch on them kind of in order, and please stop me where you have questions. The first of those is that true uncontrollable line of that $1 million. So we're talking about that $1,012,000 of the local current increase to our continuation budget. And specifically right now, the only proposed budget that's on the floor is the one from the governor's office. And so the governor has proposed a number of salary increases. He said that teacher pay, administrator pay, and a variety of other things are being proposed, as he will then engage in conversations with the General Assembly. Once more, we don't know what those increases are. What we rely on is what we expect, trend data that we've seen before, and then we pay very close attention to the legislative process as it gets closer. But what we have to be is very conservative in our thoughtfulness about what those impacts could be. So when we think about the impacts to the retirement system, our insurance increases, and certainly insurance continues to go up. I've had a number of conversations, and I'll just use this as a specific example. When I think about conversations we have with Mr. Fender and with Mr. Sosha, cybersecurity and cyber insurance continues to increase, and school systems are one of the populations that are at great risk, and we have to pay very close attention to that. And so as insurance increases, we have to attend to that. Another specific example of it is, as we've shared with you during the construction updates, we are about to have a brand new school facility across the street, and we have to ensure that new school facility in different ways. And so when we pay attention to those things, we have to build estimates for that. The state salary schedules I've referenced as it relates to the state in terms of understanding when they say that there's going to be a 7% increase for teacher pay or a 3% increase for administrators, or all employees are going to get some increase. We have to factor that in to those employees that are in our local budget, as well as the charter school piece that I've talked about. The two bullets below that are the opportunity with that remainder. And one of the things that we have been talking about with our employee groups and otherwise is the opportunity to continue to invest and retain the high-quality teaching staff that we have in our community. We know that the recruitment and retainment strategies that school systems often utilize are what ways do they create a more competitive environment to retain and keep their very best people. And local school systems across the state, in concert with their boards of commissioners and their boards of education, set those local supplement rates, and they vary across the board. As an example, in Asheville City Schools and Buncombe County Schools, their supplements range from 9% to 16% based on years of service with that school system. Ours are flat rates in the school system. If you're a certified personnel, it's 8.5%. If you're non-certified personnel, that's 6.25%. As we talked about at the beginning, that's paid in 2 installments in our school year. It's paid in November, and we pay it right before Thanksgiving break. It has been one of the real joys of folks in our school system before the holiday break to receive that additional bonus and that investment. And then we pay another one at the end of the year in June. And so that $290,000 could potentially represent this board's ability to increase the local supplement for all employee groups by 0.25%. So again, $290,000 to do that. And I would put an asterisk next to that number, and Mr. Socia would probably encourage me to do so by saying, because it's ultimately dependent on what happens in the top bullet. So if the state changes all teacher pay, let's just say 5%, then that affects local supplement because it's a percentage of that base salary pay. And so we ideally had hoped to be able to propose a 0.5% increase that might bring certified staff to 9% and non-certified staff to 6.75. Right now, that would be too ambitious a proposal because we have to be very conservative in watching what the state does. However, we would ask this board to give careful consideration to, depending on what happens at the state level, that we might be able to actually utilize those local dollars to increase the supplement by 0.5%. Now again, 0.5% may not sound like a lot to a lot of people, but every dollar that we can invest in our staff makes a huge difference. And when we think about the impact of that, to do so may cost us as much as just shy of $600,000. And so we have to pay very close attention to how we do that. But we feel like it's an opportunity, again, to make sure that we invest, stay competitive, and support our very best staff. It does pain me as the superintendent to think that someone could serve in Buncombe County or Asheville City just north of us and potentially receive 16% for essentially staying in service to that school system. That's a challenge. Mr. Rhodes faces it. It's one of the first questions young people ask when they are at teacher fairs and you're being recruited from a college or a university, and you're dealing with a Chapel Hill or a Carborough, and they're saying they're paying 15+% or 20% on a local supplement. They understand that's a factor that drives employment choice. And so we always want to equip our HR folks with the very best resources to equip and retain the very best people. And that's the lens for this particular proposal. Yes, ma'am.
When's the last time we've given a increase in the supplement?
A couple of years ago.
It's been several years, but we will find out the date for you, Miss Case.
It's okay.
I will say, in working with student teachers from UNCA for many years when I taught in Nashville, most of them said, well, I live in Henderson County, but I'm going to teach in Asheville City Schools because the supplement is much larger. I mean, I know I was at like either 12.5 or 13.5% supplement, and it's a big difference when you're barely, paying the bills as it is. So
Most certainly.
Ooh.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And just kind of as a frame of reference, Mr. Rhodes did some homework just 2 years ago as it related to this. And so when you think about that, like in our school system, our average supplement paid along that is about $3,800 total to our employee groups. If you were in Buncombe County at that same, it's $4,700. And so that's a big deal. $1,000 a year. I mean, that's a mortgage payment, that's a house payment, that's otherwise like that. That makes a significant difference for those folks. And so we recognize the opportunity to look at this and say the board can give consideration to increasing that, continuing that, and then might even have the ability, depending on what happens at the state level, to consider increasing that supplement to 0.5% if those dollars are present. What other questions about this particular slide? Any?
Do you recall what Transylvania and Polk is?
Yes, ma'am. Transylvania is at 8.5% with us for their non-licensed staff. They're at 2%. Polk County's 4.5% for their certified staff, and it's 0 for non-licensed staff.
Oh, wow.
Now, again, that was at our last research.
Right.
I don't know if they've changed it since we did that work. Other questions? So to speak to capital outlay for just one moment, and as I move from this slide, I'll turn it over to Mr. Carl Taylor to talk about the elements that are associated with it. But I think it's critically important to just revisit how these 4 categories came to be. we used to talk about capital just in that local capital allowance, which had been $1 million. Been $1 million, about 50 cents a square foot for our school system. And to the infinite credit of our former superintendent and the Board of Commissioners and this board, we started having some very considerable conversations on the heels of our 10-year facility assessment that said, if you have 2 million square feet of facilities, you have to take care of them. We can't just build them well and then hope, as we like to say, hope is not a strategy, right? We can't just hope that they are well maintained and cared for with no resources to do so. And so as we were engaged in conversations with the Board of Commissioners and through our Joint Facilities Committee, we started talking about not just annual maintenance needs and safety enhancements, which were critically important at that period of time, but we started talking about those bottom two as equally important in understanding how we invest in our school systems. Asset preservation. If you have a brand new school in Edneyville, we want it to last for generations of students, and we want to care for it well, not just build it well that first time. And in addition to that preservation, we have to have planning and design thoughtfulness, that strategic planning that sort of says, where are we going and what do we need to do? You know, our most recent conversations around our 10-year facility assessment, our capital needs survey with the Department of Public Instruction, our land use study, all of those are being used to kind of drive what directions are we going and what needs will this school system have well beyond just 1 year from now. So that planning and design piece becomes very important. And then the renovation and the expansion of those facilities. So as we think about those spaces and we think about how we strategically align our resources, we're also thinking about, okay, how do we best use? And we were having this conversation on Monday about how we best use the facilities that we have, where they can be expanded, where they can better serve those communities. And so capital outlay really functions in those four spaces. We'll talk initially here about the first two in greater detail, and then of course those last two really kind of hinge on the maintenance, repair, technology, and safety dollars. So at that time, Mr. Taylor, I'm going to flip right here. Are you able to see the slide from where you are, sir? Yes, sir. You go right ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Bryant, and good afternoon, board members. As I prepare to go through this slide with you, I guess, Mr. Craven, the question I have for you and the board is, do you prefer that I stop after each line item to answer questions, or do you want me just to go through it and then discuss at the end?
We'll stop you when we get to one.
When the need arises?
Yeah.
All right, yes, sir. All right.
I'm gonna stop you on number one, but go ahead.
All right. You know, I'll be ready for that. So, in preparation for this slide, I did meet with our directors of facilities, capital projects, and safety as well to make sure that this list that we're proposing to you today hits on the biggest needs that we have within our district. And as you look at this slide, the last column where you see the tier, that is the level of importance that we see. So tier 1 being most important, and then working to a tier 3. And so I'll go ahead and start with that first one. As you look here at this slide is the fleet management contract. And so for next year, that would be the second year of that lease with an anticipated cost of $80,000.
Let's talk about that lease. Where are we? I know we had some struggle with the language with the contract with the fleet management company. So where are we with that?
Yes, sir. And I'm going to pitch it to Mr. Socha in just a second, but I appreciate that context because where our attorneys serve us well is they read each of those contracts and have an expectation that they do so with a fine-tooth comb. And they were working together through that. Once the board approved that approval is contingent on us making sure that all elements of that fleet contract were acceptable by legal counsel based on the intent of this board and the leadership. And so I'll let Mr. Socha talk about where that stands right now.
I have a scheduled meeting, which today's Wednesday?
Yes, sir.
So tomorrow to meet with Chad to finalize the documents. And he has already reached out to the dealers for vehicle preparation to get in line pending the finalized documents to be sent his way.
And so do you anticipate that we're going to take ownership or lease of those vehicles in this fiscal year?
We should be getting some, if not most of them, in this fiscal year.
And so, but we're paying this year, but we're not going to receive most of those until, or some of those until next fiscal year?
We have not paid anything yet. We have set the money aside for that first year of the contract, and we will not begin paying on that until we have the documents and the vehicles in possession. So we haven't spent any of those dollars yet.
And what have you guys decided on selling of the extra cars that they said that we had on hand?
Well, a couple of them are not sellable.
Scrappable?
He had this look.
I was wondering
Ask
where
Mr.
you're-
Egoff to reconsider that for us.
You might be surprised. The market's pretty tight right now.
Yeah.
I don't know the very value of duct tape, but we have some on them. Mr. Klump has done an excellent job getting us to this point with a couple of the sedans that we had particularly. As far as the other ones, I believe most of them we actually want to keep available to us for the short use thing, so that we're not using the new ones for the short beat up kind of runs, according to what Martin has said. And there's not a lot of value in those old vehicles. They're not on insurance anymore. They are simply the vehicles that we have that we use sparingly.
Would it be wise just to go ahead and roll it into next fiscal year, and then we don't have to outlay the $80,000 until next year?
That would certainly be an option. We would probably have to earmark some money because we will be entering into it this year. So some of that money will be due this year.
Because, we're middle of April, right? So we've got how many weeks of school left? 8 weeks of school, something like that left. And we're going to spend, remind me again, what was that year one lease cost that we spent?
75,000 was the dollar figure.
And so we haven't spent that money yet.
Right.
We haven't taken any vehicles yet. We've got 2 months and some change left in the fiscal year. Wouldn't it just make sense to start that in the next fiscal year?
If that's what the board wants us to delay that and just have it be year one next year, or use the current year dollars as next year's dollars, we could do it that way if that's what you'd prefer.
And Mr. Socia, would you correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to make sure I'm making note of, as Mr. Craven is saying, if we were to receive those vehicles in the current fiscal year, we'd be paying the prorated amount for the receipt that we would have, and any dollars that we had allocated in capital would go into capital fund balance that were unspent in this current year. So let's say, for example, if it cost us $15,000 to receive those vehicles for the month of May and June, if you will, and the remainder was $60,000 that this board had budgeted that went unspent, that would then be put into capital fund balance at the end of the fiscal year in that respect.
Yes, yeah, that's what I was trying to say was, yeah, we will have some expense this year, not the full expense. So we would need a little bit of money in next year's budget for whatever we spent this year to make the lease whole for that year.
So why do you need 80 grand? Because a full year of lease is going to run from May to May, right? And then you've got another month and a half to make up in that lease year of next fiscal year. So why do you need 80 grand to cover that?
You're correct. We don't actually need all of that at time. We were just keeping year 1, 2, and 3, and then we would have those dollars, and they would be in the budget to finish that third year out, which would actually be in the fourth year, where we would not actually have to ask for any additional dollars in that year.
So we could revise this number to that effect, Mr. Craven. This number could be revised as soon as we knew what the rollover amount was going to be. So if we used that example, let's say $60,000 went unspent in this current fiscal year, and it was dedicated to the enterprise lease. That 60 could roll over, and then the only number you would need there would be like 15. You see?
I think that's
Or-
kind of my point.
Yes, sir.
Couldn't we just have another project that was,
65 grand?
I mean, yeah, like right here. Bam, the next few of them are almost.
We
at that
could.
money.
Again, building this was, again, assuming not taking any dollars from the current year and rolling them into next until we knew exactly what they were. So that, as a placeholder, says those dollars have been budgeted. I think to Mr. Craven's point in that question, certainly we would be able to say, okay, we were able to roll over X amount of dollars for when those vehicles were finally received, and then the board could consider another project to include in that line.
So what happened when we left here? I thought everything was good with them. So what's happened?
What was approved at that time was our ability to execute it, but the contract then has to be reviewed by our attorneys. And there was
Basically.
language in the contract that our attorneys had questions about, needed clarifications, and then there were some concerns about a specific sentence in there that ultimately had to be addressed. And so our attorneys were going back and forth with theirs, and we, of course, were not going to execute that until our attorneys felt like all was well. And so, as Mr. Socia is saying, we feel like that issue's now been resolved, and our attorneys have said that they're satisfied with the contract language.
Okay.
Mr. Taylor?
The next item is labeled undesignated for strategic capital, $200,000. That money would be available in emergency situations that arise in the upcoming year that allows us to maintain, preserve, and repair any needs that come up within our facilities.
You know, I had one element to that. We learned a great deal about that 400,000 COVID reserve in this current year. And if we've learned anything in the last 12 months, we don't have any idea what's coming next. And while that is not a dollar figure that is associated with the appropriation from the county, we can create the same kind of flexibility for this board to sort of say, hey, if there's some unknown need that arises in November or otherwise, so that line would remain unspent without us presenting something to you for approval that would fall into that category. So it gives the board the same flexibility that that $400,000 COVID reserve fund has allowed us to do.
So it's not necessarily for central office?
No, ma'am, it's just categorically
for-
like that it would
okay.
remain unspent until we brought it back to you.
Next line item is the softball field lighting lease. It will be year 3 there at East Henderson High School. That anticipated cost is $25,000. The next three line items fall under school safety. The first one is equipment, materials, and device replacement. Some examples of that would be something as basic as signage at schools, whether that be parking or do not enter signs, things of that nature. Could be cones. For this past year, a lot of that money went towards COVID-related expenses when we're talking about PPE and the signs that had to go up in schools for that reason. And so that line item is marked at $25,000. The next one, evacuation and reunification equipment. Our director of safety is working on that plan. And so as that plan continues to be worked through, part of that is also going to require having equipment. Whether that be something like a trailer, tables, chairs, toiletries. I mean, you think about if we take an entire school and have to relocate them, what all has to be quickly and readily available to make that work be as seamless as possible. And so that line item is $20,000. The final one there for school safety is the annual software subscriptions and contracts for $10,000. And an example of that would be for our card access readers at the doors. There is a computer program that is required to run and operate those doors and the card access readers. And with that comes the cost of a subscription. Moving on, the next softball field lighting at West Henderson, much like East Henderson, that is going to be year 3 of that lease with an anticipated cost of $25,000. The next one is similar, kind of like the undesignated one up above that we started with, and this is for classroom furniture replacement. As our schools continue to age, so does the desk, tables, chairs, and other items within our facilities. And so this is a opportunity for us to be very strategic in how do we have a plan in place to maintain the furniture in our schools, to continue to update and upgrade as needed as we continue to move forward. And so that line item is marked at $100,000. For custodial, next line item, auto scrubbers, new zero-turn mowers. That is an annual maintenance cost of $30,000 to where, again, that's allowing our maintenance department to stay on top of replacing those items since they get used so heavily across our entire district.
How many scrubbers and zero turns is 30 grand by?
Not a lot.
I mean, a zero
and
turn is
so-
like almost 10 grand anyways. I
Yeah,
mean,
and so what that does, it's not that every school gets a new one every year, but it allows us to have a system in place to where as they age and the amount of repairs exceeds what the value of the product is worth, then it allows maintenance to be able to replace that as needed.
Are we doing our own lawn maintenance or are we contracting that out?
As far as I know, every school and every facility is done in-house, whether that be at the school level or our maintenance department taking care of it. All right. The next line item is for transportation and activity bus replacement. That was there last year as well, and what that is allowing our transportation department to do is to maintain an activity bus fleet that allows for safe travel of our students whenever they are traveling either within our county or outside of our county. I asked Mr. Klump this morning whenever he stopped by to see me, how old is our oldest activity bus? And he says he believes we still have one that's back from the 90s. He did just ground that recently because the axle needs to be replaced, and the cost of that axle outweighs or is greater than the actual value of the bus.
Well, we say 90s, and that's 30 years.
I know, man.
Right,
Like
I know.
that's like what? That's not.
It went by fast, Mr. Craig.
It did,
It
clearly.
did. It did.
Yes. The new buses. I know that we were. Are we still adding Wi-Fi to them?
I would have to.
No. Why not? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Sure. I'm sure when I
They're
was in
on
school.
Twitter or
Yeah,
Instagram.
that's what I was thinking about coming back from. Right. Okay. Yeah.
And I would
Sense
just,
to me.
yes, sir. As a former student athlete myself, I would like to say I didn't do any homework on any trips. I'm sorry, Miss Case. I thought about doing my homework. That was about fellowship and readiness and focus for the athletic event. But it is helpful to know about activity bus replacement. Why that is a critical need for the school system is we know that our yellow buses are replaced by the state after years of service, right? So after a mileage limit or a year, years of service on the road, those buses are then replaced by the state. And every year we replace buses, and they're paid for by the state, and they just pass through the dollars. Activity buses are not that way. And so those are a local cost to the school system. And again, to ensure that our children are safely traveling to Franklin and back. And over the mountain and to the various events. It is an important need. And as Mr. Taylor mentioned, this was on the capital outlay last year, and we've received that activity bus, and it's in our fleet right now. And this gives us an opportunity to continue to bring that fleet up to date.
Why don't we paint those when we first get them in the school colors of the school they're going to?
Used by everybody.
They're used all over the
Yeah.
county.
Yeah, they're used
Well,
by.
a lot of times they sit at the specific school, and East will have a bus out there that they're using for whatever.
That'd be a big cost though, wouldn't
I
it?
know they
Oh, well,
rotate a
they're
bit, but
paying
I'm not
anyways,
sure
right?
the rules
Oh,
of,
they are.
of
Either
if we
white
can
and
paint
brown.
them.
Right.
One school would not want to
Probably
be riding
paints
in a bus of the other color.
That's right. I don't know the answer to that question, but I will write it
Yes.
down. Yes, sir, absolutely. Had that been Final Jeopardy, I would have a blank screen, right? Leave that.
No, I don't know. I mean, it was just something popped in my head.
Sure.
It's not something
Well,
that's overly important, but
I can say that years ago, all the schools had activity buses that had their school
They
colors
did.
painted.
yes.
But back in those days, there were a limited number of sports, and so the number of teams who were traveling were not as many. But being a former high school principal, middle school, normally we would have 4 activity buses at least sitting in our parking lot. But some days we would be taking 6. Some days we'd be taking 3. So the need for transportation for athletics has increased over the years
Yeah.
substantially.
And but typically you're going to find your oldest activity bus, whether that's at one of the 4 high schools, or I think there's 2 of them sitting at early college, maybe 1. We would replace it for that school typically, and it sits at that school. That's what we're doing now, correct? That bus isn't going to every school.
No, they often are. They often
They
are.
often
Based, yes, sir, based on the needs. So, for example, frequently you'll see a couple of coaches and some teachers go to one school to pick up
To
3
grab a couple
buses
of 'em.
because East High needs 6 that
Okay.
day.
And elementary schools use them too when
Yes,
they go
ma'am.
on
Most
field
certainly.
trips or whatever.
Most certainly.
The next item is listed for Apple Valley Middle School. That is to replace the auditorium seating there in that facility. In checking with maintenance, it is believed that those seats are the original seats from when that school opened. Our maintenance department from time to time has had to piecemeal the repairs at that school, which is why that item is listed there. It is anticipated cost of $160,000 for that auditorium seating. The next one, again, is labeled for the central office, but it is for athletic facility improvements. So again, as we think about maintaining, preserving, renovating our facilities, our athletic facilities would be a part of that as well. And so when we think about whether it be fencing, the bleachers, the restroom repairs, things of that nature, big repairs that go beyond the scope of work that a school really could be responsible for.
Do you have anything earmarked now for that?
Specifically, and Mr. Rhodes has spent quite some time kind of thinking about that. I'll use bleachers as an example. If you've been to a ball game, in some instances they're not up to code. In some instances they need to be replaced. In some instances they are long over their useful life, and so they're targeting some areas like that to begin with. When you think about the necessary equipment to maintain facility spaces, we've been talking about that. As I've been riding around to schools, I've often seen some areas where the fencing is not acceptable in terms of what that might look like. And again, we want to make sure that those costs, in the same way that we've articulated our investment in asset preservation through the MRTS and otherwise, are not costs that get deferred directly to schools. There was a time when there were many sponsorships that would, for example, support a scoreboard or what have you. Those days are becoming less and less and less and less. And when a scoreboard needs replacing or otherwise, we want to be able to have some resources to be able to support our schools and our school facilities in that respect. But we'd be glad to kind of come back to this board with a more detailed list of ultimately what gets utilized in that. But we know that one of the critical ones, if you've been out to any of our stadiums or to our gymnasiums or to our facilities, is we've got some code issues with our bleachers that need to be addressed. And bleachers are not cheap.
What about the cost for the turf? That's not something that we've really talked about. I mean, we did when we were, getting bids and all that on it, but is that something that's pretty costly?
Mm-hmm.
So eventually the life of the turf will need to be replaced. But I don't think this money, the expectation, we would not be using these dollars to replace the turf. That's going to be another capital need that we
Joint
will go back to
facility need.
with the joint facilities. But to your point, there are always times where we are still having to purchase equipment to help upkeep the turf. So those are dollars that we would be able to use for that as well.
Uh-huh.
From my recollection, it was 7 to 10 years was the average age of that
that's
turf.
what I
And
think.
so, we're 3 years in, I believe, or something like that.
Yes,
close
sir.
to it.
Yes, sir.
Has it been that long?
It's been that long. Well, for all schools except for Hendersonville High School, which, we were promised through the county commissioners as this Hendersonville High School project wraps up that we were going to address the turf there and address the
Yeah.
track and the concession areas outside of that school. So that's a conversation that we'll have for the Joint Facility Committee as well.
Yeah, we need to try to space that
Yeah.
so it's not all.
Because it's expensive I know it's $1 million to put the new ones in, but it's still not cheap to replace them once they start to wear out, or you need to put the rubber pellets back in there, or whatever the case may be. It's costly.
Yes, sir.
The next line item would give us an opportunity to address another major meeting space within a school, and this is at East Henderson High School to replace the sound and lighting system within their auditorium. This was a project that was looked at a couple of years ago, right before COVID hit, I believe. It was being considered as an option. Again, the auditoriums are a major important space within a school. It can be used as a classroom space, meeting space during the school day, and then of course it represents an evening meeting space as well for our parents and our community members. And so that would address a need there at East Henderson.
Mr. Taylor, may I add something to that? Because it applies to two lines. This was a conversation that we had with the board as it related to our capital needs. Again, why that is a significant one is those systems the replacement parts for those systems don't exist anymore. So we are not even able to find parts to operate those sound systems or those lighting systems, because again, the age associated with them. So not is it just that they are long over their useful life. Our maintenance folks can't even source equipment. The technicians that we bring in can't source equipment. And so in many instances, once a part of that sound or light board goes down, it's just down forever. And so, as Mr. Taylor was saying, that is a critical public meeting space, a classroom space, a facility space as it relates to when we bring students together and that. But I wanted to offer that to the board, because when you think about this one at East and West, it's important to know part of the necessary relationship with that system replacement is we can't even buy anything to replace what's going on with it right now.
I have two thoughts on both of those, the East and the West piece. We have kicked those down the road past couple budget cycles because it is pretty expensive. But also, where we're at now, how much are we actually using those spaces?
They actually present a great opportunity to use the space because of the square footage in them. So when you think about our current concerns, to be able to socially distance classroom spaces or to bring students in their larger groups and otherwise, they function like gymnasiums do and stadiums do because of that square footage. And so in many respects, they are more advantageous in this current space because we can't change the square footage of a 1,000 square foot classroom. And so when we are able to use our auditorium spaces, our gymnasium spaces, or our stadiums, they really present that to us. And so as we think of the future forward and the unknowns associated with that, they may become even more critically important to our school operations.
They're used as classrooms too for the
Yes, ma'am.
drama.
Most certainly. Drama, band, chorus. In many situations, we think about forums, bring social studies classrooms in together so that they can do work together. Those kinds of things, it's a functionally used space throughout the school day.
Have they been changed since the 1960s when West and East started?
I believe that the last renovations, again, were in the 90s when those renovations
They were.
occurred. So when I look at the light and the soundboards there, but when I look at the rafters, and I've been up there with our maintenance folks in my previous role, some of that looks to be original work. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
The next line item, musical instrument replacement, gives us an opportunity to address those needs across our district. At all of our schools, there are several instruments that are school-owned and school-based there for students to use. And so that money gives us an opportunity to go back and really help those schools update those larger instruments within their schools.
And that's year 2 of that. We dispersed dollars this year. Again, a credit to this board in recognizing what Mr. Taylor mentioned. A lot of the band and music equipment that our students were using was many, many moons old. And so we invested this $90,000. This would be year 2 of that investment, and that serves all of our high school environments and all of our middle school environments.
I think an understanding too that COVID has knocked out so many fundraising events. We really are going to have to kick in, that money where in the past we probably could have fundraised for some of it.
Yes, ma'am, most certainly.
The next item is at North Henderson, much like the Apple Valley one. It's replacing the auditorium seating there in that school. Again, much like Apple Valley, it's believed to be the original seating from when that school opened in the 90s. The next two continue to be at North Henderson, and that is for baseball field lighting and softball field lighting. Leases, this would be year 1 for those leases. That would bring up those facilities to the same level that we have at East Henderson and West Henderson. And then the final line item is at West Henderson. Much like East Henderson, that would be to replace the sound and lighting system in that auditorium. And by doing that one as well, next year that would give us an opportunity to touch all of the auditoriums within our district. As we all know, the construction that's taking place at Hendersonville High School also would address their auditorium space as well. All right, so this time I'll take any additional questions that you may have.
I have one question, Mr. Taylor. When you have over here under the category scheduled replacement for these items, do you have a replacement schedule for each one of those categories?
That's something that Dr. Bryant can jump in as well. But what I've learned in these 3 months is that is a direction that we're going in with everything is really trying to be strategic about instead of just waiting for emergencies to come up, how can we be strategic in our planning about when something is going to need to be replacing? The one I've learned the most about is roofs, that we have a set schedule of that when the warranty expires for any of our roofs, that's the next one up to get replaced. But we need to be strategic in that with everything so that we're not waiting for that day where everything breaks and now we're going, what do we do now?
And
That's
that's a
wise.
wonderful question, Dr. Revis. And the answer is yes, as we started that last year. But for some of these things, no, because they would be first times. So for classroom furniture replacement, we don't have a comprehensive replacement schedule for our district right now, and we desperately need one. We need to be thinking about that. To the work of Dr. Fry and Dr. King previously, we do have now a very clear picture of our musical instrument replacement schedule and the ones that we own and what we're investing in and what the turnover of that is, because it started with a really clear picture of our inventory and what those needs were. Activity buses is a good example. We know that one now, and as we've started to add that to the capital budget. So for each of those, you would start to see then to be able to say, show me the supporting document that shows the replacement schedule, and we'd be glad to share that.
I think that's something that the Joint Facility Committee really, when we started looking at replacing buildings, and we were coming up with huge numbers to try to figure out how to fix something that hasn't been touched in 30 years, right? And to get away from that, you have to have some type of schedule to intermittently replace things before everything falls apart. And I think one of the best ones is the musical instrument replacement. To me, just like sports, music is integral in education and for those kids that gravitate towards that. And I know French horns, for example, are $2,500 a piece, you know? And I think it's important that we give those kids the same opportunities as, say, a turf field or, you know, a air-conditioned gym or whatever the case may
Most
be.
definitely. Well, and in order to get a replacement schedule, you've got to have a consistent and stable funding stream as
Sure.
well. And we've never been able to get there.
That's very true. And I think that's another important factor of the joint facility is making sure we have those open, honest conversations. Here we are. This is what we need. This is what we're looking at. And really going over that with the county so they don't feel that we're trying to pull the wool over their eyes or whatever that could possibly be felt. And I think we've got a good relationship right now that maybe has not always been there that can help us do this better.
Yes, sir. And I think
Bill's a very, he wants to get down into
Yes, he
that.
does.
He's the one that kind of helped us
Started
get here.
doing that. Yes,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
well, the real credit to that idea of sustainability, right? When we talk about that and that partnership piece that Mr. Craven's speaking about, and then the vision piece that sort of says, and we know where we're going. We're not just looking one year, one time. We're thinking about how do we make sure that we are building a pathway that says 10 years from now, if we continue this effort, this is the work that can be done, that we actually create, again, plans for service and support in our system. And as Mr. Craven is mentioning, it's kind of a perfect segue for the Mr. T piece, and that is our Joint Facilities Committee has met together in that particular space and said, okay, how do we shape what is that 2-year plan for the $4.67 million, and that there would be opportunity for this board and the Board of Commissioners representation to continue to do that, because that's exactly how we did that last time. We sat down, we talked very openly and honestly about what those priorities were. We got in the weeds, which is a really good thing to do when you're understanding all the details associated with the school system. And then we laid out a 2-year plan. And we said the HVAC at Flat Rock and Rugby were priorities and they were absolute necessities, that there were roofing and paving projects that were needed, that there were safety and security issues associated with double point entry that needed to be addressed. And then we laid out that 2-year plan because, again, we were working within a 4-year framework with the Board of Commissioners and their leadership. And so that sort of next step would be that MRTS conversation with the county leaders so that that could be shaped as well and work in concert with this, because absent those resources, to kind of one more time touch on what Dr. Revis said, we would not be able to have conversations around scheduled replacement and sustainability if those resources were not present in our community as well.
The one last thing that I'd like to talk about on this list is the lighting.
Yes, sir.
Softball field and baseball field lighting. I mean, you can do the math there, and it's expensive, 150 grand per softball field. So for those that are new on the board, we broke that up into a lease so that we're only paying 25 grand per year, only 25 grand per year per. But then we own those, of course, at the end of the lease term. On those lighting, you know, I know there's been a big thing on, what is it, dark sky compliant, and then there's energy efficiency and everything else. Do you know anything specifically about the lighting that we're going to be purchasing from 4 North?
I actually do, because I was part of that process. And what I can really brag on is if you have been to the softball fields, or I would encourage you to as they start to play, those are highly efficient LED, and they meet every standard for lighting those facilities. And so they are the finest lighting systems we have in the school system right now in those particular spaces. And it requires fewer of them, and they use less energy to do it. And so when you're looking at the lighting systems associated with the recommendations for North Henderson and their softball field and their baseball field, they would be mirrored after those same systems. The quotes that we receive from vendors to have those target numbers for you are utilizing those same systems. And again, we use the High School Athletic Association's guidelines for candles as it associates, you know, making sure that they're lit, because what we sometimes forget is, like at a athletic stadium, if you don't meet that standard, you can't host certain rounds of playoff games and otherwise. There are base lighting standards associated with that, and currently all of our facilities meet them. And so that's what's really important for us moving forward.
So on the lighting, I see North baseball and North softball, and I see East softball and West softball. So I guess East baseball.
They already have lights, and West
That are-
Baseball does as well. So what this would do is this would actually ensure that all of our currently owned school facilities, baseball, softball, and the athletic stadiums, were all lit. So there's that equity piece across our school system at this point. You remember the board, when we were talking before, we had situations at 2 schools where the baseball fields were lit, but the softball fields weren't. And this board invested in that to address that issue. But currently, North Henderson has no fields that are lit other than their stadium. And so this would bring that across the entire school system.
And then North Henderson softball field lighting is a tier 3, and East Henderson softball field lighting is a tier 1.
The reason behind that is because we've already committed to that lease. We have to pay that money.
Or they cut 'em
and-
down.
Exactly. So again, it would be, for example, if the board were to approve it at North Henderson High School, it will become tier 1 next year, because once we've committed to that payment, we have that's going to be a line item in the capital budget for the 6 years that it's there. And so now that those lighting systems are already installed, as Mr. Craven said, we don't want anybody to come and take them down. So we're going to keep making our payments.
Repo the light.
That's right.
And then finally, I've noticed that 2021 was 1.5, 21-22 was 1.5. I don't know what 19 to 20 was. Is it always about the same every year for the capital outlay?
So just previous to that, it was only $1 million. And then we started having some very considerable safety conversations. You think about the very first installation of all of our double point entry across the system. We received that additional $500,000 as a safety component, and you see that still shows itself to some degree on this $1.5 million. In the current year, it's actually 1.9 because $400,000 of it is that COVID reserve fund, but of course that would not be rolling forward into the 21-22 school year. So we're expecting that capital outlay would remain 1.5.
And then, can you get, I guess, and again, I'm halfway new to this, but I mean, we can't apply for any Title IX money, or is that for lighting for softball and baseball?
No, Title IX directs us to utilize the funding to make equitable facilities, services, and otherwise. And so there's no funding associated with it, but we have a responsibility to ensure it exists in our school system.
And that's how this came about, because the lighting, I
Yeah.
believe, at West and at
West.
East, I think it was West,
It was West.
was paid for by parents and boosters or whoever to put the lighting up
In baseball.
on the baseball field. And so it became a Title IX issue when the softball field didn't have equitable conditions as the baseball field, as was pointed out to us. And so we had to, rightfully so, do the same for the girls that we do for the boys.
Sure.
Absolutely. And I think, again, one of the real credits to our school community is the quality of your education and the quality of the facility and the quality of the services should not depend on your zip code, right? You should have the same
Gender.
high-quality resources, teaching, support personnel, facilities, all of those elements should be regardless of where you live in Henderson County. When we talk about being the choice, we want to be the choice in every community, everywhere.
This estimate here, to me, seems to be a very conservative and reasonable estimate for your 1.5 million.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Those numbers are well vetted right now, absolutely, and I appreciate that. We want to make sure that we can work within that. And to Mr. Craven's point at the beginning, I would say that lease management one is the one that's the most flexible, and it depends on when we execute and receive vehicles, and we'll know what a rollover dollar is that we could put into this and potentially give the board some other considerations from there.
Well, and the truth is, we could fill up 3 more pages.
10 more, I believe, is the,
yeah.
I think our spreadsheets have 10.
Yeah,
It's
I
10
mean,
deep.
it's,
Yes, ma'am.
you know, we're not doing everything we need to, we're just scratching the surface. So it's not like, oh, yep, we're done now. You know, there's a lot more. These are the emergencies.
So this 1.5 million, when you break it down by square footage, how does that, because these are maintenance kinds of things.
Yes, ma'am.
So how does that compare to what the state recommendation as far as to maintain your facilities by square footage, or is there such a number?
Wow, I would have to research that. I'm not sure that there's a recommended number. There may be in the facilities guidebook, but I'm less familiar with that. But I'll definitely look that up. I know that again, until we received those MRTS dollars that came through that gave us significant more investment and opportunity there. I'm pretty certain it wasn't 50 cents a square foot. So but I'll double check that. Yes, ma'am. I think that's a great question.
Yeah, this is only 75 cents a square foot.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Now, have we shared with the new board, because we replaced half of our board this time. Have we shared with them the whole 10-year kind of study that we had that the commissioners agreed to?
I don't know that we have provided a
had
hard
sent
copy.
it to me at one point. I remember requesting it, and you had
Yes,
sent
ma'am.
it.
Maybe if
But
we
I'll be
have
glad
time,
to share
we
that with
can-
everybody.
yeah,
We have a
maybe we can
digital
look at
file
it.
that outlines our 10-year facility assessment, which essentially says, what are the current conditions of our facilities? What are the recommended needs for each of those? How could they be renovated? How could they be improved? And that really was the basis for those discussions. And I think, Dr. Revs, like your question asked, that's one of those pieces that kind of factors into that is what should be the capital spend
Right.
to support those needs? Yes, ma'am.
And the other thing that concerns me a little bit, the anticipated cost here, and I'm certainly not questioning anybody, but are those current costs? Because I know that the cost of building supplies, materials, and services
yeah.
have gone
Lumber.
up astronomically over the last year. So are those pretty real?
They are current.
Okay.
However, if we've learned anything, that's as current as today.
Right.
We've watched things, and Ms. Holt probably can speak to this better than
It's
I can, but we have
crazy.
watched building and supply
Yeah.
material. We heard from our contractors that if we had not gotten the steel when we did for Hendersonville High School, that could have been a mess,
Yeah.
and because just things have escalated so quickly.
Okay.
So while those numbers are current numbers, it does
Sure.
depend on what happens in the next 3 months, 6 months, and otherwise.
And just
Have we
I'm
gone
sorry.
over budget? I'm sorry, Stacey. Have we gone over budget at the high school?
No, ma'am. Absolutely
Okay,
not.
Okay,
Absolutely
I
not.
didn't think we
No.
had, but I kept thinking. you
No,
know.
ma'am, absolutely not. I'm just saying that because that team was so well prepared,
Yeah.
and they had all their advance receipt. If, for example, we had been behind on that as we've watched steel and lumber prices just skyrocket, it could have dramatically changed that product.
All of
that
our
project.
bid packages, they were pre-COVID too. So
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Thank goodness.
It's,
Yeah,
it's
do-
on them.
And
Okay.
do we have? I'm assuming it's at each school that they're going. Maybe not room to room, but certainly even like in the restrooms. Do we have people going in and seeing? I mean, I know that at West there are some sinks that are half out of the wall. There are some stalls that have no doors. Is that part of the furniture replacement?
That wouldn't specifically, that falls within our operational maintenance
Okay.
budget in terms of how we address those kind of things. So custodial staff and administrators can submit work orders for specific needs like that. But larger scale, you think about some of our lab classrooms or even just a general classroom, We don't have a warehouse full of student desks anywhere.
Right.
And so when you have classroom desks that need to be repaired or they're long overused, this would give Mr. Taylor and his team the ability to sort of build that replacement schedule Dr. Revis was talking about and start to cycle through those things.
Okay.
Any other questions about capital outlay? All right. So we're going to shift gears for just 1 second and talk a little bit about ESSER 2 and 3. And I think it's helpful to kind of have the broader picture as this relates to where these dollars are coming from, why they exist, and then how they impact a lot of these strategic conversations. And specifically ESSER, because education is all about acronyms. We like to abbreviate as much as possible. Stands for the Elementary and Secondary School Relief Fund. And that is a congressional allocation that is in the billions of dollars associated with education stabilization. And those grant dollars were awarded to state educational agencies, which are SEAs. We're referred to as LEAs or sometimes PSUs or public school units, depending on what you're reading. But state agencies like the Department of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education received those dollars from federal agencies, and then they disperse those dollars to LEAs or local school systems to apply to needs in their schools. And there was a round, each round, so ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3, and they are awarded to state agencies based on how we receive federal money or Title I dollars under the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act. And we talked a little bit about that in terms of understanding the difference between federal requirements for how money gets spent, state requirements, and then ultimately local education agencies. Specifically, the dollars that we're about to talk about are federal dollars. They were passed through the state that then come to LEAs. In ESSER 2, or the second version of that relief, each school system received a planning allotment number or an expected allocation amount, and then that was confirmed by the Department of Public Instruction. So the state received $1.4 billion, and then they were required to pass that through to local LEAs. And Henderson County Public Schools are specifically our LEA. Our receipt is 9.937793. So those are the dollars that are now available to us as grant dollars through the federal government and then passed through the state agency to spend on needs specific in our school system. And so I say that first again, ESSER 2 is $9.9 million. What is critical to understand is what I'm going to call two functions of these resources. Number one, they have very specific rules associated with them, and we're going to talk about what those rules are. They are not dollars that can be spent on anything for any reason. And because they are federal grant dollars, we as school system staff have to craft a narrative or a grant application. And I look to Dr. Fry because she is our resident writer of such things. And again, like she's the nice one, so we have her do the writing. But we have to write within these parameters for how we intend to use $9.9 million. The other part of that, critically important to understand, is they have expiration dates. The dollars are not available to the Board of Education or to the school system forever and ever, amen. They are, in fact, going to expire, for example, ESSER 2 in September of 2023. So those dollars have to be allocated, spent, or cost savings have to be made up until that point. And I'm going to quickly just take your mind back to the fund balance slide for a second. Is if and when we are able to utilize these dollars to offset costs that we currently have in our school system, it potentially creates savings. That's when our fund balance rises, that then we can use for strategic sustainability. We talk about that. So that's what we did in the ARA money back in 2011. You then were able to utilize those dollars to spend over a longer period of time because you created savings within your school system. But again, the rules are specific, and without reading all of them to you, I would ask you to just take a careful minute to look at how the monies are expected to be spent. There's addressing specific needs of specific populations of students. There's the purchase of educational technology. Mr. Fender gets very excited about that bullet. He loves seeing that one because rarely is the money allocated for the things that he needs, and there it is. Summer learning and supplemental after-school programs, and I'm going to come back to that one in a minute. mental health services, learning loss, facility repairs specifically to reduce transmission, support student health, deal with protocols, and then implementing activities that maintain the operation and continuity of services and to employ existing staff. So those are specific, but very broad. And this information is being released really quickly right now. If I could speak candidly with the board, I would say learning about ESSER has been like drinking from 100 fire hoses, because there's so much urgency around the distribution of these dollars and so much thoughtfulness that has to go into how we spend them, and so many questions that are still unanswered about the permissible uses, that we're having to work in all those spaces at the same time. But I want to come back to the bullet about summer learning and supplemental after-school programs. When the Senate and the General Assembly passed House Bill 82, and the governor signed that and specifically referenced the summer programming formats that would be required for our school system, they also talked about these available dollars with explicit purposes for that, because no new money is coming from the state. What was referenced is there's money specifically designed for doing so. And so it is certainly our intention and our planning as we're thinking about what our summer programming is. ESSER 2 is going to be critical in supporting what our summer programming will look like in Henderson County Public Schools. And that's what the dollars are designed for. And so we intend to allocate them accordingly. So I want to pause here for just one moment and see if there are questions about this slide, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about ESSER 3 and kind of what that means as we look at all of these together. Questions about this? So that's ESSER 2. ESSER 3, the most recently approved, and I'm going to draw your attention to the first column of numbers for Henderson County Public Schools. This is the planning allotment that was released by the Department of Public Instruction in early April based on the dollars that were drawn down from the federal government. For our school system, that number is $22,237,748. $22 million. 20% of which is required, and I'm going to flip slides for a second, read the top, must be used to address learning loss through evidence-based interventions, respond to students' academic, social, and emotional needs. So that far right-hand column's not additional money. If Mr. Taylor was a math teacher, he would tell me to pay attention to my numbers. If you did 20% of that $22 million, that 4.4 is the required set-aside that can only be used for that purpose. And then, to go back to this slide, those same series of bullets for ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 can be part of the grant application for the remaining $18 million in the school system. Now, these dollars expire September 30, 2024. So over the next several fiscal years, we'll be utilizing these dollars for strategic and guided purposes and making sure that we utilize them for their intended purpose and to really leverage the support that we provide to our students and to our school communities. Now, when you think about these dollars again, and I just draw your attention, $22 million, the 4.4 as a set aside, I want you to see the most recently released information from the Department of Public Instruction. I talked about 10 fire hoses. These large-scale dollars have been released. ESSER 2 application opened on April the 1st, and we've been attending webinars. We've been listening to state guidance. We've been continuing to ask lots of questions, many of which remain unanswered. You remember Mr. Caldwell talked about having a shirt that said, "I don't know"? Well, that shirt exists everywhere right now, at the state level and the federal level. But the application opened April 1st. It's due May 7th.
Did she?
Due May 7th. Now, due is a relative term in this particular sense, because what due means is if we don't submit an application, let's just talk about ESSER 2 for a second, by May 7th, and we will, but if we weren't, those dollars would not be available to us in the current fiscal year to support summer programming that would start in June and then go into July and then move into the new school year. It's necessary to receive those funds in the current fiscal year by meeting that deadline.
Do you have to ask for all of the funds now before that May 7th deadline? I know we have a date with which we have to use the funds by or have them appropriated, which still is a little bit murky. Can you have a something on the books, or do you have to pay for it?
No, sir, that's a great question. There is some flexibility with how we allocate it. What's due ultimately is the broader plan associated
Okay.
with what our intention is. And what's helpful is that we're getting some feedback that says, we're going to be able to consider some of that undesignated until we know the specificity of it. What is true in the application is you've got to work within those guidelines. You have to talk about what your needs are. You have to talk about what your expected outcomes are, and how you're going to measure it. So as you might imagine, that what we like accountability in education. We like to say, here's what we said we were going to do. Here's how we did it. Here's how we know. That's the requirement of the application process. And so as we think through that, what we know about ESSER 2, the $9.9 million is it is needed for us to operate summer school at the scale that we're talking to our community about, because the legislature has said it'll be 150 hours or 30 days, which is roughly June and July in terms of our offerings. So it's going to be critical that we do that. What you could expect is less urgency around an application submission for ESSER 3, because we have no need to immediately draw those dollars down for our school system. And May 7th is about drawing them down in the current fiscal year. So when we think about kind of what we'll be doing between now and when we meet again at the end of this month, we meet again on April 29th, you can expect far greater clarity around what our ESSER 2 application will look like at that period of time before its submission, so that we can lay out for this board what our plans are for the utilization of those dollars. We can have that discussion. We can talk about where that all fits into those particular pieces.
So, in that 20% that they're having us put aside
Yes, ma'am.
or direct to specific areas, would that be something we could use? I think so by reading it, but for like social workers, therapists, because I've heard at the school level there's waiting lists to get in.
Yes, ma'am.
So I checked with
I love
Tanya.
Kathy Johnson.
I
Can I
know.
just say that out loud?
I know.
I would like to say that
There's
out loud
someone-
and
hey,
for the
there's someone
record.
in the back. She better be a listening.
I know. Well, yeah, I love Stephanie Alford too. You guys saw Stephanie joined us on Monday. She was at the board meeting on Monday as she is in training. But Kathy Johnson not only turned the air conditioning on for us, but she has also got
Those
me
are
a new
two-
bottle of
two
water.
big
So
things.
thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Anyway, so I checked with Tanya with Crossnor to find out, if that's true across all schools. And she said, yeah, there's a big waiting list.
Yes, ma'am. I think what we recognize is there's tremendous need in our community right now, tremendous need. And we're fortunate that we have resources that can be attached to those needs. We have to be really thoughtful about that. We have to be very strategic about that. We have to be tremendous stewards of that work. But what we're working on right now is getting clarification from the Department of Public Instruction and then ultimately the Department of Education about what are all the allowable uses for that. Because when I read those bullets, there are a lot of things that I might argue
Right.
fit each of those things. But a federal grant application, as Dr. Revis knows, is not as simple as just submitting it. It then has careful review and can be kicked back to you, and they can say, nope, you can't do that, and you can't do that, and you can't, so redo it and tell us what you're going to. So as we work through that, what we're working to understand is every element that is an allowable expense, whether it's personnel related, resources, needs, services, materials, supply, you name all those things. And then allowing that to drill down to Mr. Craven's point in the specific areas in which we say, for example, we want personnel to help support the mental and social health needs of our students. We think in terms of social workers, school counselors, support services, therapy, those kinds of things. All that may be wrapped into that piece.
I think one thing that you have to be careful though with that is that becomes a recurring expense when these dollars are gone.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, but I mean, even if you just contracted them
now
until,
contracts are different. Yeah.
yeah, just to get us through.
I think contract is a completely different way to look at it versus hiring, 4,
yeah.
5, 6 more social workers
Right.
that
Oh, yeah.
are then on your operating budget. But if we did contract with Blue Ridge or with Crossnor or with
Right.
whoever, I think that's very pertinent and needed. We just have to be really careful that we're not in 2025 like, where's that extra
Right.
$500,000 coming from?
Right.
Yes, sir.
right. But I
And
would think it
we
would
have
get us through.
historically,
Sure.
we have communicated never on this scale that I'm aware of, but we've communicated. There have been a number of individuals to the school system that were in what were considered grant-funded positions, and they were hired with the knowledge that that position had an end date to it. That it may say, and I'll use, again, just one example, if we say, this is a resource that we need, and we know we need it at a high rate for 3 more years. And we have funding for that over 3 more years. And we're just letting you know right now, there is no expectation that that would be a recurring expense moving forward. Again, this is a different scale that we're talking about right now.
Huge scale.
Yes, but we have had those conversations with individuals in the past about how that works. Yes.
For this grant, are we required to include broad-based stakeholder input like typical in the federal grants? And that's going to be tough to do in this short turnaround, particularly the URSA 3.
3 weeks.
Very much so. Dr. Fry, would you like to speak to that? Mr. Socia is happy to share that microphone with you.
Thank you. I was just looking at, it's in our CCIP is where we have to write the narrative. I know you're familiar with that. And it talks about a description and the processes used and groups involved in the development of the needs assessment and plans specifically for ESSER II funds, including but not limited to school leaders, classroom educators, and other stakeholders. So you are exactly right. Thank goodness we have some other needs assessments that we have put together, as you well know, for previous federal grants that we can pull some information from, and then some more immediate data that we have to put it all into context. But yes, we sure do.
And the state guidance has been exactly that, Dr. Rose, that there are data points that we've utilized for previous federal grant programs that are applicable in this particular instance as well. Yeah. What other questions about this specifically? Again, as I said, this is in a lot of respects a foreshadowing for later this month because we are spending a great deal of time right now learning. Right? We are being lead learners right now. We are attending quite a bit of statewide conversation around tell us everything you know. We're planning regularly. We are spending a great deal of time crafting what that will look like and establishing those so that we can talk about that in greater detail. Are there more questions about the allocation, what it represents, or the categories that it has to be used in?
John, are we
Yes,
doing anything else for addressing learning loss besides summer school?
Well, we'll be doing quite a few things. Yes, ma'am. Summer school is the most
Right, immediate.
immediate one, but as you might imagine what the next several years are going to look like, we know that one of the most critical pieces is how do we bridge back toward re-engagement. So much of what we're going to be talking about with our students and our staff is really being catalysts for re-engaging in the school environment because this year has been difficult for so many people in so many ways. We know learning has been occurring, but we also know that learning has looked different for everybody in different spaces. And so part of re-engaging our students is using these resources, to your question, to support what that looks like in the years forward. Yes, ma'am.
Are you expecting a big summer school turnout? Because I keep hearing from different parents, like I have an AIG student.
Sure.
I have a student takes AP courses and they're failing, so I just wondered if that, if I'm just hearing from a loud group of a few parents or if that's all the way.
What we know is it's going to be contingent on a couple of things. And one is we hope that we can offer a summer experience to every student that wants it, right? The legislation says you first have to determine your at-risk populations, and based on availability, that's your starting point. And then beyond that, as space is available. But what we know about space is that's directly related to staffing, right? This is entirely voluntary for students, and it's entirely voluntary for staff.
Yeah.
We have to craft the structure for it, and the legislation was specific about some of the parameters for how people would be compensated, but we've asked a lot of questions to better understand that because we know it has been, again, a challenging 12 months. And to say to folks, there's really no end to the school year. We're going to continue through that. For parents, for families, and staff, we're going to have to make sure that there's a really clear picture of how those folks are being compensated, how they're being supported to do that, so that we can clearly recruit for it. Just over spring break, when HB 82 was passed and then signed by the governor, right, all that happening while we were on break, we finally got the parameters for summer school. We had been waiting to know what is the framework that we're operating in, and we now know at least that. And so we have been able to craft our basic planning framework within that in terms of the offerings. And as we've shared with this board before, our goal is that we would have offerings at every school site if we can staff it. And so that's going to be dependent on some answers around how the funding is going to be working, because this, the question was made, the difference between 12 and 10-month personnel. This is outside of the 10-month window for all of those certified personnel. They would be taking on additional employment.
Yeah.
So again, staffing will be a driver. Student and family participation will be a driver. And as soon as we know more, we're going to be publishing that. You can expect that in the coming weeks, more and more information is going to be pushed out publicly about what that framework will look like for us.
Are buses going to be supplied?
Yes, ma'am. It's a requirement that we provide transportation. It's a requirement that we provide meal service. It's a requirement that we provide instruction and physical education and opportunities for that. You can expect it, while it will not feel like a school day, it will look like one. And I want to be very clear about the difference between those. Our ideas for engagement and that camp feel, that idea of hands-on experiential learning to support core instruction is critical in our principles. But in terms of buses on the road and cafeteria services and traditional schedules, that kind of 8 to 4, it will look very much like a school day.
How does after-school childcare play into that? Are we thinking about any wraparound services for?
Yes, ma'am. So we're working through those
Okay.
those details right now. It's a great question in terms of understanding. So what does that look like in the morning or the afternoon,
Right.
and where will families need that? Similarly, in the summer, our services have looked different. We've more had a summer
Exactly.
plus approach at a series of sites. So we're having to work through what those details might look like. Yes, ma'am.
And can some of these funds be used to support those wraparound services?
We're not sure yet,
Okay.
but we are asking those questions.
don't
Yes,
know.
ma'am, absolutely. But those are the questions. What I love about Dr. Revis is she thinks like we think, right? Like we're trying to answer those questions are exactly the ones we're trying to get answers to right now. What other questions? Mr. Chairman, I've walked through our local current expense, our considerations for the local current expense and the continuation of that, and what we might consider moving forward. I've made notes of the questions that we've received from the board as it moves forward. We have that one outlier piece as it relates to MRTS, and hopefully we will have an opportunity to bring this board more information about that as joint facility gets together in the coming weeks and otherwise. What other data points would you like us to discuss or offer as we prepare for the next workshop setting?
Did you want to talk about any of the alts?
Sure, I'll flip one slide. One of the things that we did last year, this is the last slide in the board packet, is when you think about the local capital outlay, and I'll go back to that enterprise number again. Let's imagine that we get to revise that number, and now we have $60,000 that can be reallocated because it was unspent in this current year. One of the things we did for this board last year, as you were thinking about local capital, is to give you other projects that are of need that could be considered as dollars are available. And so Mr. Taylor and his team have put these into a tiered category for alternate consideration, that if, for example, $60,000 were available, that the board could have discussion around what would be next, what next project we might consider. Yes, sir. And so I'll be glad to either answer questions or have Mr. Taylor answer any questions about these particular pieces, but they're listed there for you as additional needs from our annual maintenance and replacement schedules.
Excavator for real?
Yes, sir.
Do we even have the equipment to tow around an excavator?
We have one of those construction trailers. Yes, sir. I believe ours is. Do you have the age on our current one?
30 years.
30 years.
Oh, that's a baby for an excavator, though. They're not. I mean, they last for a while. What do you use an excavator for?
Well, we use it for a variety of resources whenever it kind of comes down to, I'll just use an example of if we're having to move a mobile unit, or we're having to set up an additional space, if we're having to clear something out, or whenever we have plumbing issues or sewer and drain issues that are on our property that we have to maintain. We're doing all the digging, we're doing all the replacing until we get out to the public part of that. And so we talk about 2 million square feet, but we have hundreds and hundreds of acres of property that are our responsibility till you get to the public utility. And so, just as an example, West Henderson High School had some issues with culvert drainage,
yeah.
and right, so we were having to do all the digging and all the replacing and everything that was necessary there. So it's not necessarily a new construction issue, but it's about maintenance.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think you guys laid out very well the capital outlay for this year, and I'm happy with that. You know, there's a couple things in there that always make me.
Yes, sir.
I think with the Joint Facility Committee getting together, and I know the county's going to receive another $30-something million outlay from these federal COVID relief funds. I think it's going to be important for us to kind of get together soon so that we can present to the board how are those ESSER funds going to be used, how are the ESSER 3 funds going to be used, what are our priorities moving forward for this next set of MRTS monies, and what major capital projects are going to be coming on the board, because I know in a couple of years Mills River's falling off and Dana, I believe, are falling off of our payment schedule, and Hendersonville High School will be finished in 2 years, little bit
January
less than 2 years.
2023. Yes, sir.
And so we really need to start getting that together, whether that be West, looking at middle schools and how our middle schools are bulging at the seams right now. And I'll be excited to see and put all that stuff together and really start planning for the future post-COVID.
Yes, sir.
We've tossed around a new bus garage.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Is that in?
Absolutely. I think that's going to be one of the first priorities for the joint facility. We have had discussions with the county at our last meeting that we had 2 months ago, something like that. There is land that has been identified. The need has clearly been identified, and that's going to be one of the first topics that we talk about coming up. And if we can come to an agreement with the county, maybe swapping some property, the current bus garage for this other property, I think that would be the first thing, or one of, if not the first thing, one of the first things we need to do immediately.
Have the county commissioners visited our present bus garage?
Yeah, I know that most of them have. I don't know about the Mr. Andriotta or
Mr. Hill. or
Mr.
Ms.
Hill.
McCall.
Yeah, I don't know if they have. I know that Mr. Lapsley and Mike have been out there. They're very interested in that property because it attaches to their waste facility there. And so we've had many conversations about it. It's just one of those things that was never, sexy enough to like go after, like building a bus garage. But it is needed.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have ever been there. I would suggest that you do go there at some point in time and talk to Fred, and it is an embarrassment.
Oh, like the second floor's condemned.
It is condemned. I mean, we cannot even fit our buses now fully
Yeah,
into the
and-
garage. That's kind of crazy.
And if I
So-
could couple that, if you don't mind,
Sure.
certainly that need is paramount.
Yeah.
But it's a real credit to our transportation staff, what they
They
do
keep it
with
going.
that as a resource.
Oh, absolutely.
It's exceptional, knowing what is afforded to them.
So that's really my number one concern there. And then I also just want to really focus on growth. We know the growth is coming in the northern part of the county, especially, and with all these new developments coming and 600 units and 300 units and whatever it is, we're really going to have to plan on where are we putting kids, because Glen Marlow's full, Mills River's full, Rugby's busting at the seams, West is right there at it. We have some plans on the books right now to expand some of those facilities. We just need to reprioritize and figure that out, and then bring that to the board, and then we all come to a consensus on what we need to do.
This is not capital, but we've talked about continuing virtual after COVID. Is that on the books? Have
We've been
y'all
having
thinking
lots of
about it?
conversations instructionally about what that will look like, and we really look forward to kind of sharing what that plan looks like moving forward in the coming board meetings. Yes, ma'am.
Are we going to talk any more about current expense, or is this the forum in which to discuss?
This is definitely the forum in
Okay.
which to discuss, and similarly, the next board workshop would be that as well.
Well,
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to throw some things out there. I mean, we've just been keeping our head above water this past year. I mean, I want to see us start thinking about and being visionary about programmatic improvements and enhancements. And, I got so excited when I heard Dr. Edney talk about, the program that we're going to be able to implement with one teacher. Come on.
Yeah.
Come on, guys.
Right.
We need to step up. I mean, an investment in us building our own group of potential teachers into our workforce.
Needs more than one
I
teacher.
mean, we're investing in the community when we do that.
Uh-huh.
And so I say that we go for a program enhancement and let's get another teacher locally paid to do that. We used to do program enhancements. And now we're just trying to keep our head above water.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I would really love to see us move forward. And I think it's something we can sell to the county commissioners because of that benefit to our community. Because a strong educational system is the bedrock of your community. And guys, there is a teacher shortage. It used to be the day when you had an elementary teacher leave, you had them lined up at the door coming in. It's not like that anymore. And coupled with, you know, the non-competitive supplements, I mean, we have to grow our own, and we have to invest in these young people, and what better way to do that? So I would love to see us think about, you know, a program enhancement line item. And the other thing that I would say is, looking at Mr. Fender and technology, my hat's off to you guys. I don't know how you've done it this year with that limited staff. They have been awesome. But through your leadership and their dedication, we've made it. But we've got to get another technology staff member or two somewhere along the line.
We did
We
add
one, didn't
some,
we? Did we do
not
one more
last
person?
budget year. Was it last
Last
budget year?
year.
Budget year.
Last year.
Yeah.
So where are you with your staff? Yeah.
Only the existing came back as soon as I had made it. Tomorrow to interview. Still trying to build up that position.
What about growing it with one of these hot shots? I mean, I know my kids know more than me. You want Leah Faye? She probably could do it. But you know, like getting, you know, somebody out of, whether it's out of Blue Ridge or,
Interns.
and
or-
yeah, just growing them.
Long conversation. Coordinator in Blue Ridge. Working with technology department. They can't find it. At some point, I hired three. Blue Ridge over the past 7 years. They haven't. As soon as one, hey, I'd like to do this, they're gone. And there's no free entry.
Mm-hmm.
It's a $10 baseline. Time for one.
Yeah, Chick-fil-A is hiring at $15 an hour now, so it's got to be.
Yeah.
Well, no, but it's good for us to know.
And if I could add kind of two pieces to that, because I think Mr. Fender touches on a really powerful point that we want to hold fast to, and Dr. Revis does, as it relates to program enhancement. The ESSER flexibility may give us opportunities to tackle some of those things right now, and then we have a responsibility to think about sustainability from a recurring standpoint, where we set those long-range priorities. The other piece is, and there are just no two ways to say this, we've had conversations in this room about the need to address the local salary schedules for market competitiveness, especially in our support personnel positions across the board. Yes, the state sets the teacher schedule. Yes, the state sets the principal schedule. But in order that we make an investment in ourselves and we keep pace with being able to hire qualified folks to work in our many divisions. We sometimes think about the school system as just being what happens in the classroom. It's all the people that help make that classroom possible that are equally important. And those are conversations that can't be lost either. Like, in order that we're able to do that, it's not just the technician position, it's personnel across the entire school system. And as we continue to be advocates, whether it is in the local supplement or otherwise, we will be thinking strategically in that respect in order that our programs can be supported the right way, that we are investing in the right things, and that all those things match what our goals are. And that our goals being like, we want the most robust, vibrant, and dynamic school system in the country. Like, that's us. Like, we're going to be that. But dynamic means we move, right? And we say we cannot be a school system that sits still, because we don't have that luxury. Our kids deserve more than that. Our staff deserve more than that. And certainly you as board members have a higher expectation than that. And so to support our divisions, to support our students, we are at a point right now where we are going to have flexibility that we've never had. But we are going to have to use that in a way that sees beyond just those expiration dates, so that we are great stewards of those resources and we're thinking thoughtfully about how that's helping us accomplish our work.
We could even propose that maybe in this first year, the county commissioners pick up a quarter of a position and increase that every year to grow this group of teachers. But again, if we're going to stay competitive, it's not about things, and it's about people. The people we invest in. That's how we become that premier school district.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. If I might add one more thing, and then I've made some notes, and certainly will follow up with the board as it relates to the 10-year facility study, so everybody has that information. If there is any information that you need from staff between now and when we meet again on the 29th, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or to Kathy directly, so that we can make sure that we provide that to everybody. And so if there's specific information you would like as a follow-up to anything that we've talked about, we'll have answers to your questions and then share those with everybody. But we definitely want to make sure that we're equipping you as a board with all that you need to make the best decisions possible for the budget that you ultimately approve. Because again, that is our opportunity to say to the Board of Commissioners, here is our plan for investing in our community and being great stewards of those resources. And so whatever you need to feel informed as a board member to do that, please do not hesitate to let us know. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I want to ask Wendy, is that, you had the girls' camp last year. Is that going to be done again?
The STEM, yes, we are.
Have you expanded it? We
Yeah.
talked about expanding it.
No, we haven't expanded it, but I also want to mention that we are moving forward with the health sciences year's camp as well.
Oh, nice.
It's beginning to feel more normal this summer.
Good. I'd like to thank you and Dr. Bright and the staff for putting together this information. A lot of work, I recognize, has gone behind this, and I appreciate that.
If there aren't any other questions, we will wrap up for today and pick this up in 2 weeks. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Second.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned.